"Would you like to have lunch with us?" asked two 7-year-old homeless twins to the lonely man sitting alone in the restaurant, not knowing he was a millionaire with a terminal illness. Before we jump in, this story reached people in over 50 countries last week. Let's see how far it goes today. The December rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Diner as Richard Morrison sat alone at table 12, the same spot he'd claimed every evening for the past 3 months. At 67, with silver hair perfectly combed and wearing a coat that cost more than most people's monthly salary, Rick appeared to be just another well-dressed gentleman dining alone. But appearances, as he'd learned recently, could be devastatingly deceiving. The waitress had long stopped asking if he was expecting someone. He wasn't. Not anymore. Not since Helen passed 5 years ago, and certainly not since Dr. Patterson delivered the news that would forever divide his life into before and after. 6 months, maybe less. The pancreatic cancer had been growing silently, just like everything else meaningful in his life seemed to happen, without his knowledge, without his consent, without his ability to throw money at the problem and make it disappear. "Excuse me, mister?" The small voice startled him from his brooding. Rick looked up to see 2 identical faces peering at him through the rain-streaked window. 2 little girls, maybe 7 years old, with matted blonde hair and clothes that had seen far better days. Their eyes held that particular combination of hope and desperation that comes from knowing how to smile even when the world has forgotten how to smile back. The bolder of the 2 pressed her small hand against the glass. "You want almoçar with us?" she asked, mixing languages in that innocent way children do when words become bridges instead of barriers. Rick's first instinct was to look away. He'd built an empire by knowing when to engage and when to retreat, and 2 homeless children pressing against his dining sanctuary definitely fell into the retreat category. But something in their faces, perhaps the way they weren't really begging, just offering companionship, made him pause. The second girl whispered something to her sister, and they both giggled. It was a sound Rick hadn't heard in his vicinity for longer than he cared to admit. Through the glass, he could see their breath forming small clouds in the cold evening air. "Sir?" The waitress, a kind woman named Maggie, who'd been working at Murphy's since the Clinton administration, approached his table. "Those 2 have been out there for about an hour. They do this sometimes, ask folks if they want to share dinner. Never seen them beg outright, though. Kinda breaks your heart." Rick looked again at the girls. The rain was picking up, and they huddled closer together, still watching him with those impossibly hopeful eyes. In the space of a heartbeat, something shifted in his chest. Maybe it was the morphine talking, or maybe it was the realization that he had nothing left to lose and 6 months left to find something worth gaining. He nodded toward the window. "Ask them if they'd like to come in." Emma and Sophie Turner had perfected the art of survival with the precision that only children forced to grow up too fast could master. At 7 years old, they knew which restaurant managers would call the police and which ones might slip them leftover bread. They knew the difference between someone who might help and someone who might hurt. And they knew that the well-dressed man at table 12 was different from the others who'd shooed them away. "He said yes," Emma whispered to her sister as Maggie beckoned them inside. "I told you he had kind eyes." Sophie, the quieter of the twins by exactly 17 minutes, squeezed her sister's hand. "Remember what Mama used to say about strangers, Em?" "This is different," Emma insisted, though her voice carried the slightest tremor. "Look at how sad he looks. Maybe he needs friends, too." Inside Murphy's Diner, the warmth hit them like a physical embrace. The sisters had been living on the streets for 2 years, ever since the car accident that took their parents and left them bouncing between an overwhelmed foster system and their own desperate resourcefulness. They'd learned that sometimes the safest place was no place at all. Rick studied the girls as they approached his table. Identical twins, with cornflower blue eyes and faces that spoke of resilience beyond their years. Their clothes were clean but worn, suggesting they'd found somewhere to wash but nowhere to call home. "I'm Emma," the bolder twin announced, sliding into the booth with the confidence of someone who'd learned that courage was often the only currency that mattered. "This is Sophie. We're 7. Well, I'm 7 and 4 hours. Sophie's 7 and 3 hours and 43 minutes. 43 minutes exactly?" Rick found himself asking, surprising himself with the genuine curiosity in his voice. "Sophie keeps track," Emma explained seriously. "She's good with numbers. I'm good with people. We make a good team." Sophie nodded solemnly. "What's your name, sir?" "Richard, but you can call me Rick." He paused, studying their faces. "Are you girls hungry?" The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Rick recognized the pause. It was the same hesitation he'd seen in boardrooms when people were trying to decide how much truth they could afford to reveal. "We had lunch," Sophie said carefully. "Yesterday." The simple honesty of it hit Rick harder than any of Dr. Patterson's medical explanations. Here he was, a man who could buy the entire restaurant without checking his bank balance, sitting across from 2 children who measured meals in days instead of hours. "Well," Rick said, his voice gentler than it had been in years, "I was about to order dessert, but everything here is too big for one person. Think you could help me out?" Emma's eyes lit up. "We're very good at helping with dessert. I bet you are." Rick caught Maggie's eye and nodded toward the menu. "What do you say we start with some hot chocolate and work our way up to the apple pie?" As Maggie bustled away to place their order, Rick found himself really looking at the girls for the first time. They had the kind of beauty that tragedy couldn't quite diminish, all big eyes and quick smiles, with an alertness that spoke of intelligence and adaptability. "So," he said, leaning back in the booth, "tell me about yourselves." The hot chocolate arrived in mugs almost as big as Sophie's head, topped with whipped cream that made both girls' eyes widen. Rick watched as they wrapped their small hands around the ceramic warmth, and something in his chest, something that had been frozen since Helen's funeral, began to thaw. "We used to live on Maple Street," Emma said between careful sips. "In a yellow house with a garden. Mama grew tomatoes, and Daddy built us a treehouse that looked like a castle." "Used to?" Rick prompted gently. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "They went to heaven 2 years ago, car accident on Highway 95. We were at school." The simple way she said it, matter-of-fact and clean, like she'd practiced telling the story until it hurt less, made Rick's throat tighten. He'd lost Helen to cancer, had months to say goodbye, to prepare. These girls had lost everything in an instant, with no preparation, no goodbyes, no chance to understand why. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. That must have been very scary. "Foster homes are scarier," Emma said with startling directness. "The last one had 7 kids and 1 bathroom and a man who yelled a lot. So we left." "Left?" Rick's business mind immediately went to logistics. "How long ago?" 3 months, Sophie said. "We're good at taking care of ourselves. Emma's brave, and I remember everything Mama taught us about staying safe." 3 months. Rick did quick calculations. These girls had been surviving on their own since September, through the harsh Boston autumn and into winter. They couldn't be more than 40 pounds each, and they'd been living by their wits and whatever kindness strangers might offer. The apple pie arrived, a massive slice that could easily feed 4 people. Maggie had brought extra plates and forks, and Rick found himself cutting careful portions while the girls watched with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for magic shows. "This is the best pie in the whole world," Emma declared after her first bite. "Better than Mama's, but don't tell her we said that when we see her again." Sophie elbowed her sister gently. "Em, remember what we talked about?" "Oh, right." Emma's face grew serious. "Mama and Daddy are in heaven forever, Evan. But sometimes I forget and think they're just on a really long trip." Rick felt something crack inside his chest. Here he was, facing his own mortality with anger and self-pity, while these 2 children faced orphanhood with grace and hope that defied logic. They'd lost everything, yet they still believed in kindness enough to invite a stranger to dinner. "Where do you sleep?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Different places," Sophie said diplomatically. There's a shelter on Pine Street that sometimes has room, and the library stays open late on Thursdays. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store lets us help sometimes, Emma added. She gives us sandwiches and lets us use the bathroom. Rick made mental notes. These girls had created a survival network that most adults would struggle to navigate. They'd learned to read people, to find kindness in unexpected places, to make themselves useful enough to earn safety. It was impressive and heartbreaking in equal measure. What about school? The sisters exchanged a look that spoke of conversations Rick couldn't hear. We were good students, Sophie said finally. Before. Emma liked art class, and I liked reading. But you need an address for school, and adults ask questions when you don't have answers. Rick found himself leaning forward. What kind of questions? Where do you live? Who takes care of you? Why don't your parents come to parent-teacher conferences? Emma's voice took on a sing-song quality, like she was reciting a familiar list. We tried telling the truth once. They called social services. Me and social services means foster homes, Sophie finished. So we decided to take care of ourselves until we figure out something better. As the evening stretched on, Rick found himself drawn deeper into the girls' world. They spoke of survival with the casualness of children discussing their favorite cartoons. And he began to understand that their resilience wasn't just impressive, it was miraculous. We have rules, Emma explained, counting on her fingers. Never steal, never lie unless it keeps us safe. Always stay together, and never trust adults who promise too much too fast. The last rule hit Rick like a physical blow. Here he was, a man with more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and these children had learned that promises from people like him were dangerous. Smart rules, he said carefully. Who taught you those? We figured them out, Sophie said. Trial and error. Mostly error at first. Rick's phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Patterson about his next appointment. The reminder of his diagnosis felt surreal, sitting across from 2 children who'd faced more adversity in 7 years than most people encountered in a lifetime. Emma, Sophie, he said, surprising himself with the decision forming in his mind. I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Both girls straightened, their alert expressions suggesting they'd learned to recognize when conversations turned serious. I live alone in a big house, too big for one person, really. And I was thinking, would you like to stay there tonight? Just for tonight, he added quickly, remembering their rule about promises. You'd have your own room, warm beds and breakfast in the morning, no strings attached. The sisters looked at each other with the kind of wordless communication that only twins possessed. Rick could almost hear the rapid exchange of thoughts, concerns and possibilities. Why? Sophie asked finally. You don't know us. We could be trouble. You could be, Rick agreed, but I don't think you are. And it's going to snow tonight. I checked the weather. Emma's eyes widened. Snow? Really? 3 to 5 inches, Rick confirmed. I have a fireplace and a kitchen full of food that never gets eaten, and... He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign in his mouth. I think I could use the company. It was the truest thing he'd said in months. Since his diagnosis, he'd been living in a bubble of medical appointments and financial preparations, surrounded by people who were paid to care about his well-being. These girls offered something his money couldn't buy, genuine human connection with no ulterior motive. Just one night? Emma asked. Just one night, Rick confirmed. Tomorrow morning I'll bring you back here or wherever else you want to go. I promise. Sophie studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned that survival depended on reading people correctly. You're not lying. I can tell when adults lie. Their voices change. I'm not lying, Rick said, but you should know something else. I'm not well. I'm not dangerous, he added quickly, seeing their expressions change. I'm just sick, so if you decide to stay, you should know that. The honesty seemed to tip the scales. Emma reached across the table and patted Rick's hand with startling gentleness. We're good at taking care of sick people too. We took care of each other when we had the flu last month. Rick felt tears threaten for the first time since his diagnosis. These children, who had every reason to be bitter and suspicious, were offering to take care of him. "So?" he asked. "What do you think?" Emma and Sophie looked at each other one more time. Then Emma smiled, the first truly carefree smile Rick had seen from either of them all evening. "Okay, Mr. Rick, one night, but if you turn out to be a secret villain, Sophie will karate chop you. She's been practicing." Rick couldn't help but laugh. "Duly noted, though I should warn you, I make terrible pancakes." "That's okay," Sophie said seriously. "We're good teachers." Rick's house in Beacon Hill was the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines. 4 stories of federal-style elegance with original hardwood floors and windows that looked out over Boston Common. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Rick watched the girls' faces press against the car windows. "It's like a castle," Emma breathed. "A real castle in the middle of the city." "It's very clean," Sophie observed with the practical eye of someone who'd learned to assess shelter quickly. "And big. How many people live here?" "Just me," Rick said, and the words felt heavier than usual. "It used to house a family of 8 back in the 1800s. Now it's just me rattling around like a marble in a shoebox." He led them through the front entrance, watching as they took in the grandfather clock in the hallway, the oil paintings Helen had loved, the Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. But instead of being overwhelmed, the girls seemed to approach each room with curiosity rather than intimidation. "This piano is beautiful," Sophie said, running her fingers lightly over the keys of the Steinway in the living room. "Do you play?" "My wife did," Rick said softly. "I kept meaning to learn, but, well, work always seemed more important." Emma had wandered to the wall of windows overlooking the garden. "Is that a real tree house out there?" Rick followed her gaze to the elaborate structure Helen had commissioned for the grandchildren they'd never had. "It is. I had it built a few years ago, but no one's ever used it." "Can we see it tomorrow?" Emma asked, then caught herself. "Oh, wait, we're only staying one night." The reminder hung in the air awkwardly. Rick found himself wishing, not for the first time that evening, that his circumstances were different, that he had decades instead of months, that he could offer these girls something more than one night of warmth and safety. "Let me show you to your room," he said instead. The guest bedroom on the 2nd floor had been Helen's project, a space designed for visiting family that had hosted exactly no one since her death. Twin beds with white linens, a window seat overlooking the garden, and a bathroom larger than some apartments. "This is ours?" Sophie asked, and touching the bedspread with the reverence usually reserved for museum artifacts. "For tonight, yes," Rick confirmed. "There are clothes in the dresser. Helen kept them for, well, just in case. They might be a little big, but they're clean and warm." The girls explored the room with the careful wonder of children who'd learned not to get too attached to temporary comforts. Emma tested the window seat while Sophie examined the books on the shelf, running her finger along the spines like she was greeting old friends. "Mr. Rick," Emma said from her perch by the window, "thank you. This is the nicest place we've stayed since." "Since Mama and Daddy," Sophie finished quietly. Rick felt that crack in his chest widen. "You're welcome. There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry, and I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Just make yourselves at home." As he reached the door, Sophie's voice stopped him. "Mr. Rick, you said you were sick. Are you scared?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Rick found himself giving the honest answer he'd been avoiding for months. "Yes, I am scared. We were scared too at first," Emma said, "after Mama and Daddy went to heaven. But being scared together is different than being scared alone." Rick looked at these 2 7-year-old girls who'd just offered him the kind of wisdom his expensive therapists had failed to provide. "You're right. It is different." "Good night, Mr. Rick," Sophie said. "Good night, girls." As Rick closed the door, he heard Emma whisper to her sister, "I like him, Soph. He has sad eyes like us, but kind sad. Not angry sad." Standing in the hallway outside their room, Rick felt something he hadn't experienced since Dr. Patterson's diagnosis. Hope. Not for a cure, not for more time, but for something harder to define. Purpose, maybe, or connection, or simply the possibility that his remaining months might matter to someone other than his lawyers. For the first time in 3 months, Richard Morrison fell asleep without the aid of prescription medication, lulled by the unfamiliar but comforting sound of children's voices drifting through his empty house. Rick woke to the sound of whispered voices and the smell of something burning. For a moment, a disorientation clouded his thoughts. Had he overslept? Was Helen cooking breakfast? Then reality settled back into place. The diagnosis, the empty house, and 2 7-year-old girls who were apparently attempting to use his kitchen. He found them standing on chairs in front of the stove, Emma wielding a spatula like a sword, while Sophie consulted what appeared to be a recipe card written in crayon. "It says flip when bubbles form," Sophie was saying seriously. "But these don't look like bubbles. They look like explosions." "Maybe explosions are just angry bubbles," Emma replied philosophically, poking at what had once been pancake batter and now resembled abstract art. "Good morning," Rick said, trying to keep the amusement out of his voice. "How's breakfast coming along?" Both girls spun around, their faces displaying identical expressions of guilty determination. "We wanted to make you breakfast," Emma said quickly, "since you were sad and sick, and Mama always said food helps when people are sad and sick. But your stove is different from the one we used to have, and the pancake mix might be expired," Sophie added helpfully. "We couldn't read all the letters on the box." Rick surveyed the kitchen, which looked like a flour bomb had detonated. Somehow, in the space of what couldn't have been more than 30 minutes, the girls had managed to coat nearly every surface with some combination of flour, milk, and what appeared to be syrup. "How about we work together?" he suggested. "I know this stove pretty well." The next hour passed in a blur of cooking lessons and laughter. Rick found himself teaching Emma how to flip pancakes, while Sophie appointed herself head of bacon management. They were terrible at it. The pancakes came out lopsided, the bacon was either burned or undercooked, and somehow flour ended up in everyone's hair. But it was the most fun Rick had had in his kitchen since Helen's last birthday. "These are the best pancakes ever," Emma declared, drowning her misshapen breakfast in syrup. "Even though they're kind of crunchy?" Sophie asked practically. "Especially because they're crunchy," Emma insisted. "It's like eating pancakes and cereal at the same time." Rick found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. These girls had somehow taken his pristine, quiet kitchen and turned it into chaos, and all he could think was how alive the house felt, with their voices echoing off the walls. "Mr. Rick," Sophie said between bites, "can we ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you live in such a big house all by yourself? Don't you get lonely?" "Nah." The question was delivered with the casual directness that only children could manage, cutting straight to the heart of things adults spent years learning to avoid. "Yes," Rick said simply. "I do get lonely." "We get lonely too," Emma said. "Even though we have each other, sometimes you can be lonely even when you're not alone." Rick studied their faces, wondering when 7-year-olds had become so wise. "What do you do when you feel lonely?" "We tell each other stories," Sophie said, "about Mama and Daddy and about the yellow house and about what we want to do when we grow up." "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Emma's eyes lit up. "I want to help kids like us, kids who don't have mamas and daddies anymore. I want to make sure they don't have to be scared. And I want to be a teacher," Sophie added, "because teachers help people learn new things, and learning makes you less afraid of the world." Rick felt something settle in his chest, a sense of recognition, of rightness that he couldn't quite name. These girls weren't just survivors, they were dreamers. They'd faced the worst life could offer and emerged not bitter or broken, but determined to make sure other children didn't have to face the same struggles. "Those are beautiful dreams," he said quietly. "What about you?" Emma asked. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" The innocent question hit Rick like a physical blow. What did he want to do with the time he had left? He'd spent 3 months focused on what he was losing, his health, his future, his plans. He'd never stopped to consider what he might still be able to give, looking at Emma and Sophie, Flour still dusting their hair and syrup sticky on their fingers, Rick felt an answer forming. Not the answer he would have given yesterday, but the answer that felt true in this moment, in this kitchen filled with laughter and imperfect pancakes. "I want to help you make those dreams come true," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Rick realized he'd just made the kind of commitment that violated Emma and Sophie's rule about adults who promised too much too fast. But as he looked at their faces, surprised, hopeful, and just a little bit scared, he knew it was a promise he intended to keep. "Really?" Sophie asked quietly. "Really," Rick confirmed. "If you'll let me." Emma and Sophie looked at each other with that twin telepathy again. Then Emma smiled, not the careful smile she'd worn at the restaurant, but a real smile, bright and trusting and completely transformative. "Okay, Mr. Rick, but first, we need to teach you how to make proper pancakes." "These are definitely not right." Rick laughed again, and the sound echoed through his house like it belonged there. 3 weeks had passed since that first snow-covered morning, and Rick's Beacon Hill mansion had transformed from a mausoleum of memories into something resembling a home. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator door. Sophie had claimed the library as her personal reading sanctuary, and the sound of children's laughter had chased away decades of silence from the halls. But reality, Rick had learned, rarely respected the fairy tales people tried to create. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice belonged to Janet Walsh, a stern-faced woman from Child Protective Services who stood in his doorway like an unwelcome harbinger of bureaucracy. "We need to discuss the Turner children." Rick's blood chilled. The girls were upstairs doing homework at the kitchen table, Emma helping Sophie with math, while arguing about whether 7 times 8 was the same as 8 times 7. They'd settled into routines so naturally that Rick had almost forgotten their arrangement was temporary, unofficial, and potentially illegal. "Please come in," Rick said, though every instinct screamed to slam the door. "Would you like some coffee?" "This isn't a social call," Janet replied, pulling out a tablet and stylus with military precision. "We've received reports that you're harboring 2 minor children without proper authorization. That's a serious matter, Mr. Morrison." Rick led her to the living room, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He'd been so focused on giving Emma and Sophie stability that he'd ignored the legal realities of their situation. In Massachusetts, you couldn't just take in orphan children because it felt right. The girls needed help, Rick said carefully. They were living on the streets. "And that's commendable," Janet said, though her tone suggested anything but commendation. "However, there are proper channels for these situations. Foster care exists for a reason. They ran away from foster care multiple times." "That's not uncommon," Janet admitted, consulting her tablet. "Emma and Sophie Turner, ages 7. Parents deceased in automobile accident 26 months ago. They've been placed in 4 different homes over the past 2 years. 4 homes. Rick felt sick, imagining what those placements must have been like, to drive 2 7-year-olds to choose the streets over supposed safety. "Why?" he asked. "Why so many placements?" Janet's expression softened slightly. "They're challenging to place. Twins often are, because not many families can take 2 children simultaneously, and these particular girls have trust issues. They're intelligent, resourceful, and have a tendency to disappear when they feel unsafe." Footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Emma appeared in the doorway, Sophie close behind, both girls taking in the scene with the rapid assessment skills they'd developed for survival. "Who's the lady in the suit?" Emma asked Rick directly, though her eyes never left Janet. "This is Ms. Walsh," Rick said gently. "She works with Child Protective Services." The change in the girls was immediate and devastating. Sophie stepped behind Emma, who straightened to her full 3.5 feet with the bearing of someone preparing for battle. "We're not going back," Emma said flatly. "We told you people already. We're staying together and we're staying with Mr. Rick." "Emma," Janet said, switching to what Rick recognized as a professional dealing with children voice. "I know this is scary, but—" "You don't know anything," Sophie interrupted, finding her voice from behind her sister. You don't know what those houses are really like. You don't know about Mr. Peterson who locked the pantry so we couldn't eat between meals, or Mrs. Kumar who made us sleep in the basement, or the Johnson house where the older kids stole our clothes. Rick felt rage building in his chest, not at Janet, who was just doing her job, but at a system that had failed these children so completely. I understand you've had bad experiences, Janet said, genuinely sympathetic now. But Mr. Morrison isn't a licensed foster parent. He hasn't been through background checks, training, home inspections. He doesn't need training to be kind, Emma said fiercely. He doesn't need a license to make us feel safe, and he doesn't need inspection to love us. The word love hung in the air like a revelation. Rick realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without either side acknowledging it explicitly, that's exactly what had happened. He loved these two fierce, brilliant, broken, beautiful girls, and they loved him back. I want to adopt them, Rick said suddenly, the words surprising even him. Officially, legally, whatever it takes. Janet blinked. Mr. Morrison, adoption is a lengthy process. There are requirements, evaluations, court proceedings. Then let's start, Rick said firmly. Today, right now. Tell me what I need to do. Emma and Sophie looked at each other with that twin telepathy, then back at Rick with expressions of hope so pure it made his chest ache. Mr. Rick, Sophie said quietly, do you really want to be our daddy? The question broke something open in Rick's heart. He knelt down to their level, looking directly into those cornflower blue eyes that had somehow saved his life just by seeing him as worth saving. More than I've ever wanted anything, he said honestly. If you'll have me. We choose you too, Emma said simply, and threw her arms around his neck. The next 6 weeks became a blur of paperwork, home inspections, psychological evaluations, and legal consultations. Rick discovered that wealth could expedite many things, but the heart of the adoption process, proving he could provide a stable, loving home, required something money couldn't buy: patience, authenticity, and the kind of transformation that only love could create. Dr. Patterson had been blunt about the timeline. Rick, you're looking at 6 to 8 months for a full adoption process, even with expedited handling, given your prognosis. Then we make it work, Rick had interrupted, whatever it takes. That determination led him to hire Margaret Chen, the best family attorney in Boston, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist who specialized in adoption cases. Both women had been initially skeptical. Wealthy older men seeking to adopt weren't unheard of, but they often came with complications. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Mitchell had said during their first meeting, I need to ask some difficult questions. Why these particular children? Why now? And are you prepared for the reality that you may not live to see them reach adulthood? Rick had expected the questions, but hearing them spoken aloud still felt like physical blows. I can't explain why Emma and Sophie came into my life when they did. I only know that they saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving. And as for the future, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I'd rather give them 6 months of being truly loved and wanted than let them spend years bouncing between homes where they're just obligations. Dr. Mitchell had studied his face for a long moment. And if your health deteriorates rapidly, what provisions have you made for their care? I'm working on that, Rick had said. But I need you to understand something. These girls have already lost everything once. They've already faced the worst thing that can happen to children. They're stronger and more resilient than most adults I know. If something happens to me, they'll grieve, but they'll survive. And they'll survive knowing that for at least a little while, they were someone's whole world. That conversation had taken place 3 weeks ago. Now, sitting in his lawyer's office while Emma and Sophie colored in the waiting room, Rick felt the weight of time pressing down on him like a physical force. The good news, Margaret Chen was saying, is that the state is motivated to place these children permanently. Their history of running away from foster care works in our favor. It demonstrates that traditional placements haven't been successful. And the bad news? Rick asked, though he suspected he knew. Your medical situation complicates things. The court will want assurance that the children won't face another traumatic loss in the immediate future. Rick had anticipated this obstacle. I've established a trust fund that will ensure their financial security regardless of what happens to me. And I've been in contact with my sister-in-law, Helen's sister Patricia, in California. She's agreed to serve as their guardian, if necessary. What he didn't mention was the conversation he'd had with Patricia the previous week. She was a good woman, a retired teacher with grown children of her own, but she'd been honest about her limitations. Rick, I'll honor Helen's memory by caring for those girls if something happens to you, she'd said. But I'm 63 years old. I was planning on grandchildren to visit, not children to raise, and I've never dealt with kids who've been through trauma like Emma and Sophie have. It wasn't ideal, but it was a safety net. Rick had also quietly reached out to other possibilities. Helen's colleagues from her volunteer work, friends from church, even distant relatives who might be willing to provide backup support. He was building a network of care around Emma and Sophie that would survive his own mortality. There's something else, Margaret continued. The court will likely appoint a guardian ad litem to represent the children's interests during the proceedings. That person will want to interview Emma and Sophie extensively. Will that be traumatic for them? It could be. These interviews are designed to ensure the children truly want the adoption and aren't being coerced. But given their history, having another adult ask them detailed questions about their desires and fears might trigger some difficult memories. Rick closed his eyes, trying to imagine Emma and Sophie sitting across from a stranger, being asked to justify their choice to stay with him. They'd already been through so much evaluation, so much questioning of their judgment and autonomy. When? Next week. The guardian ad litem is Dr. James Richardson. He's experienced with adoption cases involving older children and trauma survivors. Rick nodded, filing away the name for his own research. What else do I need to know? The judge assigned to your case is the Honorable Maria Santos. She's known for prioritizing children's welfare above all other considerations. If Emma and Sophie can convince her that this adoption is in their best interests, and if your character references check out, we have a strong chance of success. A strong chance. Rick wished he could feel more optimistic, but his latest round of tests had shown the cancer's continued progression. Dr. Patterson estimated he had perhaps 4 months left, possibly less. The adoption process needed to be completed in the next 6 weeks, or Emma and Sophie would face another loss, another disruption. Another reason to believe the world was fundamentally unsafe. Margaret, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. These children cannot go back into the foster system. Whatever happens to me, whatever legal arrangements need to be made, they cannot be separated and they cannot be placed with strangers again. Margaret's expression grew serious. Rick, I can't guarantee. Then make it happen, Rick interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built an empire through sheer determination. Whatever it costs, whatever strings need to be pulled, whatever favors need to be called in, those girls have been through enough. Margaret nodded slowly. I'll do everything in my power. It would have to be enough, because for Emma and Sophie Turner, failure wasn't an option Rick was prepared to accept. Dr. James Richardson turned out to be a kind-faced man in his 50s, with the sort of gentle demeanor that immediately put children at ease. Rick watched through the living room window as the guardian ad litem spent an hour with Emma and Sophie in the garden, their conversation animated and punctuated by the girls' laughter. When they finally came inside, both girls seemed relaxed rather than stressed, which Rick took as a positive sign. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Richardson said, settling into the chair across from Rick while Emma and Sophie headed upstairs to play. I need to discuss some concerns with you. Rick's stomach dropped. Concerns? Nothing about your character or suitability as a parent, Dr. Richardson clarified quickly. Your background check came back clean, your financial resources are obviously adequate, And frankly, I've never seen two children more attached to a potential adoptive parent. Then what's the problem? Dr. Richardson pulled out a notepad, consulting his notes. Emma and Sophie are remarkable children. They're intelligent, articulate, and surprisingly well-adjusted given their experiences. But they're also deeply traumatized by loss. Rick had expected this observation. They've been through counseling. I'm not questioning their therapy, Dr. Richardson interrupted gently. I'm questioning whether they truly understand what it means to attach themselves to someone who may not be part of their long-term future. The words hit Rick like physical blows, even though he'd been expecting them. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Emma and Sophie have learned to survive by not getting too attached to temporary situations. But with you, they've done the opposite. They've invested completely. Sophie told me you're the first adult since her parents who's read her bedtime stories. Emma said you're teaching her to paint watercolors because her mother used to love watercolors. Rick felt his throat tighten. Is that bad? It's beautiful, Dr. Richardson said honestly, and it's also terrifying. Because if these children lose you, they're not just losing another placement. They're losing someone they've chosen to love as a father. They've already lost their parents, Rick said defensively. They know that people die. They're stronger than you think. They are strong, Dr. Richardson agreed, but strength has limits. And these particular children have already reached those limits once. I'm not sure they could survive reaching them again. Rick stared out the window at the treehouse he'd built for grandchildren who never came, now used daily by two girls who'd claimed his heart completely. So what are you recommending? I don't know, Dr. Richardson admitted. That's why this case is so complicated. In normal circumstances, I'd recommend placing Emma and Sophie with younger parents who could provide long-term stability. But they don't want younger parents. They want you. And the bond you've formed with them is genuine and profound. They've been failed by the system repeatedly, Rick said quietly. Foster homes that didn't protect them, social workers who didn't listen to them, adults who made promises they couldn't keep. I'm not going to be another adult who decides what's best for them without asking what they want. What if what they want isn't what's best for them? It was the question Rick had been avoiding, the one that kept him awake at night. What if it is, he countered. What if 6 months of being completely loved and wanted gives them something they can carry for the rest of their lives? What if knowing that someone chose them, fought for them, loved them unconditionally, becomes the foundation they build their futures on? Dr. Richardson studied Rick's face carefully. You've thought about this extensively. It's all I think about, Rick admitted. Every day I wake up knowing I'm running out of time, and every day I see those girls becoming more confident, more secure, more willing to trust the world. They're thriving, Dr. Richardson. For the first time in 2 years, they're thriving. And when you're gone? Rick had prepared for this question, though the answer still felt inadequate. I've made arrangements. Financial security, educational trust funds, a support network of people who care about them. And most importantly, I'm documenting everything, video messages, letters, stories about their parents that I've helped them remember and preserve. When I'm gone, they'll know beyond any doubt that they were loved completely. Dr. Richardson made notes, his expression thoughtful. The judge will want to interview you personally before making her decision. When? Next Friday. Judge Santos likes to conduct these interviews in her chambers, less formal than a courtroom, more like a conversation. Rick nodded, though his chest felt tight. Next Friday was exactly 1 week away. According to his latest medical appointment, he was still stable enough to handle legal proceedings, but Dr. Patterson had been clear that his condition could deteriorate rapidly. Dr. Richardson, Rick said as the man prepared to leave, can I ask what you're going to recommend to the court? The guardian ad litem paused at the door, his hand on the knob. I'm going to recommend that Judge Santos interview Emma and Sophie one more time, without any adults present, and then I'm going to recommend that she make the decision that honors what those children have already survived, what they've already overcome, and what they've told me they need to feel safe in the world. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Rick would have to accept that it was the best he could hope for. As Dr. Richardson's car pulled away, Emma and Sophie appeared at his side. "Are you okay, Mr. Rick?" Sophie asked, slipping her hand into his. "You look worried." "Just thinking about grown-up stuff," Rick said, squeezing her hand gently. "Is it about us?" Emma asked directly. "About whether we get to stay?" Rick looked down at their upturned faces, those blue eyes that had somehow saved his life by seeing him as worth saving. "Yes," he said honestly, "it's about us. We're going to be okay," Emma said with startling confidence. "All of us, together." Rick wished he had her certainty, but he held onto her words like a prayer. Judge Maria Santos had a reputation for being fair but uncompromising, which made Rick's hands shake as he sat in her chambers the following Friday morning. The room was smaller than he'd expected, lined with law books and family photos that spoke of a woman who understood the weight of the decisions she made about children's lives. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Santos began, reviewing the files spread across her desk. "This is an unusual case in several respects." Rick nodded, not trusting his voice. "You're 67 years old, recently diagnosed with terminal cancer, and seeking to adopt 2 7-year-old children you met less than 2 months ago." She looked up from the paperwork. "Help me understand why this is in the best interests of Emma and Sophie Turner." Rick had rehearsed this moment for days, but sitting across from the judge who would determine his family's future, all his prepared words disappeared. Instead, he found himself speaking from his heart. "Your Honor, I've spent my entire adult life building a business empire. I've accumulated more wealth than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I've owned houses around the world, cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries, art that belongs in museums. But until Emma and Sophie knocked on my restaurant window, I'd never experienced the kind of wealth that matters." Judge Santos leaned forward slightly. "And what kind is that? The wealth of being needed, of being chosen, of waking up every morning knowing that your existence matters to someone else's happiness." Rick's voice grew stronger. "Those girls didn't choose me because I'm rich, Your Honor. They don't even fully understand what money means. They chose me because I saw them as human beings worthy of respect and love, and I chose them for the same reason." "But Mr. Morrison, what happens when you're no longer able to care for them? What happens when they lose another father figure?" Rick had dreaded this question, but now, facing it directly, he found clarity instead of fear. "Your Honor, Emma and Sophie have already faced the worst loss imaginable. They've already survived the death of their parents, the failure of the foster system, and 2 years of uncertainty and fear. They're not fragile children who need to be protected from life's realities. They're warriors who've earned the right to choose their own family." Judge Santos consulted her notes. "Dr. Richardson indicated that the children are adamant about wanting this adoption to proceed." "Yes, ma'am. And you've made provisions for their care after your death?" "Extensive provisions," Rick confirmed. "Financial security, educational trusts, a network of support including my sister-in-law Patricia Chen in California. But more than that, Your Honor, I've given them something they've never had before. The unshakable knowledge that they are wanted, loved, and valued. That foundation will serve them regardless of what happens to me." Judge Santos set down her pen and looked directly at Rick. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to share something with you that I rarely discuss. I was adopted myself at age 8 after my parents died in a house fire." Rick felt his breath catch. "My adoptive parents, the Santos family, were young and healthy. They could offer me decades of stability, excellent prospects for my future. But you know what I remember most about that adoption?" Rick shook his head. "I remember the moment I realized they didn't just want a child. They wanted me, specifically me, with all my trauma, my nightmares, my anger at the world. They chose me not despite my brokenness, but including it." Judge Santos's voice grew soft. "That feeling of being specifically chosen, specifically wanted, shaped everything about how I saw myself and my place in the world." Rick felt tears threaten. "Your Honor, I've interviewed Emma and Sophie 3 times now, Judge Santos continued, and every time they speak about you with the kind of love and certainty that can't be manufactured. They don't just want a father, Mr. Morrison. They want you as their father. Does that mean? Judge Santos smiled for the first time during their conversation. It means I'm approving the adoption, with conditions. Rick's heart stopped. Conditions? And you'll continue regular medical monitoring and reporting to the court. You'll maintain the therapeutic support for the children, and you'll execute detailed guardianship arrangements that ensure Emma and Sophie's continued care regardless of your health status. Yes, Rick said immediately. Yes, absolutely. All of it. Then congratulations. Mr. Morrison, in 30 days after the waiting period expires, Emma and Sophie Turner will legally become Emma and Sophie Morrison. Rick couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that the miracle he'd barely dared to hope for was actually happening. Mr. Morrison? Judge Santos's voice was gentle. Are you all right? Your Honor, Rick managed. You've just given me the greatest gift of my life. No, Judge Santos corrected with a knowing smile. You've given that gift to yourself, and more importantly, you've given it to 2 little girls who deserve to know what it feels like to be someone's whole world. As Rick left the courthouse, his phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. How did it go? Rick looked up at the December sky, where snowflakes were beginning to fall like blessings, and typed back, "We're going to be a family." For the first time since his diagnosis, Rick Morrison felt like the luckiest man alive. The day before the adoption was finalized, Rick woke to find Emma and Sophie already in the kitchen, attempting what appeared to be a celebration breakfast. The scene was familiar. Flour everywhere, something burning on the stove, and 2 determined faces focused on creating something special, despite their limited culinary skills. "Good morning, daughters," Rick said, testing out the word that would be official in less than 24 hours. Both girls looked up with grins that could have powered the entire city of Boston. "Good morning, Daddy," Sophie said, the word rolling off her tongue like she'd been practicing. Which, Rick realized, she probably had been. "We're making adoption pancakes," Emma announced, wielding a spatula covered in what might have been batter. "They're special because we're putting extra love in them." "How do you put extra love in pancakes?" Rick asked, settling into his chair at the kitchen table that had become the heart of their little family. "You think happy thoughts while you mix," Sophie explained seriously. "And you make heart shapes instead of circles." Rick examined the pan, where several lumpy, vaguely heart-shaped objects were sizzling. They looked terrible and smelled questionable, but they were made with love by his daughters, which made them perfect. "Dr. Patterson called yesterday," Rick said carefully, watching their faces for reactions. They'd become experts at reading his medical updates, understanding instinctively when news was routine versus concerning. "Good news or bad news?" Emma asked directly. She'd appointed herself the family's official handler of difficult conversations. "Mixed news," Rick said honestly. "The cancer is progressing, but I'm stable enough for the adoption ceremony tomorrow, and Dr. Patterson thinks I have more time than we originally expected, possibly several more months." Sophie abandoned her pancake flipping to climb into his lap. "How many months?" "Maybe until summer," Rick said, holding her close. "Long enough to help you learn to ride bikes, to plant a garden, to see you start 2nd grade in the fall if we're very lucky." Emma joined the hug, and for a moment they sat there in their flour-dusted kitchen, holding each other like they could stop time through sheer force of love. "Daddy," Sophie said quietly, "are you scared of dying?" Whoa! The question was delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that Rick had learned to expect from his daughters. They didn't shy away from difficult topics. They'd been forced to confront too much reality, too young for that luxury. "Sometimes," Rick admitted, "but not as much as I used to be." Why not? Rick thought about how to explain the transformation that had occurred since 2 little girls knocked on his restaurant window. "Because I used to be scared of dying without my life having mattered. But you 2 have shown me that it's not about how long you live. It's about how much love you give and receive while you're here." Emma pulled back to look at his face. "We love you bigger than the whole universe, Daddy." "Infinity plus one," Sophie added, which had become their family's measurement for immeasurable love. Rick felt tears threaten, but they were good tears, the kind that came from happiness too big for his chest to contain. "I love you both infinity plus two. That's impossible," Emma protested with a giggle. "There's nothing bigger than infinity plus one." "There is, when you're talking about how much a daddy loves his daughters," Rick said solemnly. The pancakes burned while they argued about the mathematics of infinite love, filling the kitchen with smoke and setting off the fire alarm. They ended up eating cereal for breakfast instead, laughing as they opened windows to clear the air. Later that afternoon, while Emma and Sophie napped in the living room fort they'd constructed from couch cushions and blankets, Rick retreated to his study to complete the final pieces of their future. The stack of documents on his desk represented months of careful planning. Updated wills, detailed trust funds, educational provisions, and most importantly, letters. Dozens of letters to be opened on birthdays, graduations, first days of school, wedding days, and all the moments when his daughters might need guidance or simply want to hear his voice again. Rick had been writing them for weeks, trying to capture everything he wanted to tell them about life, love, resilience, and their own incredible strength. The letter for their 8th birthday began, "My dearest Emma and Sophie, by the time you read this, you'll have been my daughters for several months. I hope you remember how it felt the day the adoption was finalized. How we all cried happy tears and ate an entire ice cream cake for dinner because we were too excited to eat real food." Oh, the letter for their high school graduation started, "You've probably forgotten some details about our time together, and that's okay, but I hope you remember this. You saved my life." 2 7-year-old girls saw a sad, lonely man and decided he was worth loving. That gift will echo through every day of my remaining time. Me. The letter for their wedding days read, "I wish I could walk you down the aisle, but I'll be there in spirit, bursting with pride at the incredible women you've become. You've already survived more than most people face in a lifetime, which means you have the strength to handle anything marriage might bring. Choose partners who see your worth the way I see it, as infinite and irreplaceable." A soft knock interrupted his writing. Emma stood in the doorway, hair mussed from sleep and clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Daddy, are you writing sad letters again?" No. Rick looked down at the tear stains on the paper and realized he'd been crying without noticing. "Not sad letters, sweetheart. Love letters. For you and Sophie to read someday when you're older." Emma climbed into his lap, studying the papers with the serious expression she wore when processing complex emotions. "Are they for when you're in heaven with our first mama and daddy?" "Yes," Rick said simply. "That's good," Emma said, settling against his chest. "Because even when you're in heaven, we'll still be your daughters, right?" "Forever and always," Rick confirmed. "Being someone's daddy doesn't end just because you die. It just changes form." Emma nodded sagely, then brightened. "Sophie and I have been talking, and we decided something important." "What's that?" "When we grow up and help other kids like us, we're going to tell them about you, about how you showed us that families aren't just born, they're chosen, and how love doesn't have to last forever to be real." Now, Rick's chest felt like it might explode from the pressure of too much emotion. "That sounds like a beautiful way to remember me." "It's not remembering," Emma corrected seriously. "It's continuing. Sophie's really smart, and she says love is like energy. It can't be destroyed, just passed from one person to another." As Rick held his daughter in his study, surrounded by legal documents and love letters, he realized that Emma was right. Tomorrow, they would officially become a family, and whatever time they had together, months, weeks, or even days, would create ripples that extended far beyond his own mortality. He was no longer a dying man trying to find meaning in his remaining time. He was a father, building a legacy of love that would outlive them all. The courthouse ceremony was small, but perfect. Judge Santos officiated, Margaret Chen served as witness, and Dr. Richardson attended with a smile that suggested he'd never been happier to be proven wrong about a case's complexity. Emma wore a yellow dress that Helen would have loved, bright and cheerful with a pattern of tiny flowers. Sophie had chosen blue, claiming it matched her eyes and made her feel brave. Rick wore his best suit, the one Helen had always said made him look distinguished, and carried 2 small velvet boxes in his pocket. "Emma Morrison and Sophie Morrison," Judge Santos announced officially. "It gives me great pleasure to declare this adoption final and binding." The girls launched themselves at Rick with such force that he nearly toppled over, all 3 of them crying and laughing simultaneously. In that moment, surrounded by the people who'd helped make this miracle possible, Rick felt complete in a way he'd never experienced before. "Daddy," Sophie whispered in his ear, "we're really, truly your daughters now." "You were always my daughters," Rick whispered back. "This just makes it official." The celebration continued at home, where Rick had arranged for a small party with ice cream cake, balloons, and the kind of chaos that only newly minted families could create. As evening fell and the excitement began to wind down, Rick gathered his daughters in the living room for one final surprise. "I have adoption gifts for you," he said, retrieving the velvet boxes from his pocket. Emma and Sophie sat on either side of him on the couch, eyes wide with anticipation. Inside each box was a delicate gold necklace with a heart-shaped locket. "These belong to your first mama," Rick said gently, helping Sophie with her clasp. "I contacted your old social worker, and she helped me retrieve some of your parents' belongings from storage. I had these cleaned and repaired." Both girls' eyes filled with tears as they opened the lockets to reveal tiny photos of their birth parents, professional pictures from happier times, carefully preserved despite the years of upheaval. "Inside, there's also a new picture," Rick continued, "of us as a family." The girls examined the tiny photographs with reverence, touching their birth parents' faces with gentle fingers before studying the recent picture of the 3 of them taken in the garden just days before. "Now you can carry both families with you always," Rick said. "The parents who gave you life and the family we've chosen to build together." Emma threw her arms around his neck. "This is the best day of my whole life." "Mine too," Sophie added. "Better even than Christmas and birthdays combined." "Mine 3," Rick said, using their family phrase for agreement. As they settled in for the evening, Rick found himself memorizing every detail. The way Emma's hair caught the lamplight, the sound of Sophie's laughter, the feeling of their small hands in his during their nightly reading ritual. Dr. Patterson's latest tests had been encouraging. Rick was stable enough to potentially see spring, maybe even summer if they were fortunate. But even if time ran out tomorrow, Rick knew he'd accomplished something extraordinary. Emma and Sophie Morrison would face the future with the unshakable knowledge that they were wanted, loved, and valued. They would remember a father who chose them deliberately and completely, who fought for them, who showed them that families could be built on love rather than just biology. 2 months earlier, Rick had been a dying man with no legacy except money. Now, he was a father whose love would ripple forward through generations. Emma and Sophie would grow up to help other children, inspired by their own experience of being saved by an unexpected angel. Those children would carry the lesson forward to others, creating an endless chain of hope and healing. "Daddy," Emma said, as Rick tucked them into their beds for their first night as an official family, "will you tell us the story again?" "Which story, sweetheart?" "The story about how 2 little girls knocked on a restaurant window and found their forever daddy." Rick smiled, settling into the chair between their beds for what had become their favorite bedtime ritual. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a sad, lonely man who thought his story was ending. But then 2 brave little girls taught him that sometimes the best stories don't begin until you think they're over." As Rick told the story of their meeting, their courtship, and their transformation into a family, Emma and Sophie drifted off to sleep with smiles on their faces. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, blanketing the city in the same pristine white that had covered the ground the morning after their first night together. Rick Morrison had spent 67 years learning how to live. It took two 7-year-old girls to teach him how to love, and in the months or years he had remaining, he would show them every day that being chosen, being wanted, being loved completely was the greatest gift any human being could receive or give. Their story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.